and next talk will be performed by an experienced duo. It's Vitor Ventura and Paul Rascagneres that will hold you by the tip of your fingers. Vitor works today as a Cisco Talos security researcher and threat center. In the past, he was a regional manager at IBM X-Force Iris Europe and helped several companies dealing with infections, not like Corona, but like WannaCry and NotPetya. On the other finger, we have Paul, who also works at Talos, the Cisco Threat Intelligence and Research Organization. Paul is also focused on investigating and identifying new threats, mainly on malware and advanced persistent threat campaigns. Today, they are going to talk about fingerprint scanners and related issues with you, Vitor and Paul.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, let me share my screen.
Yeah. So, yeah, it works. You can listen to me?
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. So, hi, everyone. We are here to speak about fingerprint cloning, myth or reality. So, as I was already introduced, my name is Paul Rascagneres, and I'm security researcher for Cisco Talos. I'm located in France, and historically, I'm mainly interested on APT, and such as I work on WannaCry, NotPetya, Olympic Destroyer, this kind of topic. And besides that, I'm really into 3D printing, and we will see it's relevant for this specific presentation where we will use a 3D printer on a really uncommon way.
Hi, I'm Vitor. I was already introduced also, so I'm located in Lisbon, and yeah, I've been with Talos doing research for a while now. So moving on to our agenda. We'll start by talking a little about the background, about the evolution of the several kinds of sensors and what kind of sensors do we have for the fingerprint. And then we will go into our research. So we'll start by explaining the threat model, and then we will share our process, which is divided in three main categories: collection, optimization, and creation. And then we'll explain our results, and finally we will do the wrap-up. So about the state of the art. So fingerprint authentication, it has been around for a long time, but it really began to be more widely used when Apple introduced it with Touch ID back in 2013. And it was also that same year that it was defeated at the CCC conference. So all through the years, it has already been adopted by several companies on several different devices. Another good example was in the Samsung S10, had their fingerprint authentication defeated by a simple silicon cover. And more recently, there was another presentation at a conference where they actually tried to, the researchers broke it online during the presentation on three different phones. However, they did not show their process. And we were already doing our research when we saw this, and we thought, okay, maybe our presentation is pretty much done. We don't need to do this anymore. But then again, we thought, well, maybe we should do it and show how it's done, because that is something that was not explained. And that's why we keep on going with it. There's another big aspect is that we didn't want just to focus on the technical side. We wanted to show what are the threat models behind it, and does it make sense for us to be worried about it or not. So now about the kinds of sensors. There are three major kinds of sensors. The capacitive ones, where your fingerprint is basically read because a capacitor is created between the reader and your finger. So the ridges on your finger will be the lines on the fingerprint, and the valleys will be the white parts. And this pretty much reads the electrical capacitance in your body. Then we have the active capacitive sensor, which is the same principle, but instead of using the natural electricity in our bodies, the sensor will have a ring around it that will emit the signal that will go through the finger into the sensor reader. So it's the same kind of technology, but there's an emission by the sensor itself. The optical one is actually one of the oldest ones, where, as you can imagine, there's a light source that will reflect on our finger, and then the image will be read by the sensor. These ones were pretty much abandoned for a while, but now because there is the need for frameless mobile phones, they're back, because then these kind of sensors can be put behind the display, unlike the capacitive ones where you need to have a dedicated space on the phone in order to put the reader. The same thing for the ultrasonic. The ultrasonic, there's an ultrasonic pulse that is emitted. It will echo on our fingers, and it will be read by the receiver. Again, this also can be put behind the display, not like the capacitive ones. So these are the three main sensor types that there are around here. So now about our process. When we started the process, we wanted to make this as real life approachable as possible. And for that, we decided to define three different kind of scenarios for the process. But not only the different scenarios, each scenario would have to be tied to a collection method. So first is the direct collection method. Someone just takes the fingerprint directly from our finger. It's something that can happen, of course. Then you have the sensor one. In this one, you can imagine when you go through an airport and you give your fingerprints just to be registered. In this case, your fingerprints are being read by the sensor, and this may be an acquisition form. And finally, by a third-party collection. So you're drinking something, you leave your glass behind, and someone will pick that up and collect the fingerprints from this object. So these are the three different collection methods that we tie to different threat scenarios. So after the collection, there's an optimization stage. So if each different kind of collection has its strengths and its vulnerabilities. And for that, we actually need to have an optimization component where we enhance or optimize the data that was collected. And finally, there's the creation. So we collect the fingerprint, we need to optimize it depending on how it was collected. And finally, it needs to be, then it will be, the fingerprint will be created. So, and now I'll pass you to Paul to explain to you the collection methods.
Yeah. So let's speak about the collection. The first one is direct collection. For this case study, I decided to use plastilin, which is a fake clay, if you wish. It reacts to warm. So you have a heat pistol on the right, and when the plastilin is hot, it becomes soft, and you can take make a mold of the model you wish. In my case, it's my finger, and that's how I create a mold for direct collection. The next one, yeah, it's optical sensor collection. So for this collection, I decided to use the cheapest sensor I found on the internet. So this optical sensor cost less than 20 euros. The quality is pretty bad if you look at the picture on the right, but I was surprised, but it was good enough for our test, and I was able to use this kind of really small picture by doing some optimization we will see later. And the next collection is third-party collection. In this case, I decided to take a picture of a fingerprint on a glass. In this case, it's not my finger because I don't want to lick my finger. When you will see this kind of picture, it's the palm of my hand and not my finger. So, but the process is exactly the same, and it's simply for illustration. So let's speak about optimization, because once I have the data, I need to make a few work to have something exploitable. If I work on pictures, typically if I take the cheap fingerprint sensor I used, the resolution of the square where you put the finger is really low, and I or my finger are big, I don't know, but I cannot have my finger in a unique photo. I need to take a couple of images and merge the image together, as you can see in this picture. In this example, for example, it's Al Capone fingerprint. So the document is directly on the FBI website, and I use it as an example to same thing for avoiding leaking my own fingerprint. But it works exactly the same way with my finger. Another photo optimization, if I take the third-party collection, I need to increase the contrast. So first step, I use black powder, it's graphite in my case, to have this thin black line. And I take a picture, increase the contrast, and switch in black and white to have this kind of black and white high contrast image on the bottom right. And once I have this image, I need to use this image to create a mold. So we don't directly create the fingerprint. We create a mold with 3D printer, and we use this mold to generate, to create the fake fingerprint. In this screenshot, you can see the picture and the 3D model of the fingerprint. So I create a negative of the fingerprint directly in 3D. Next. So the creation itself, I'm sure you are not really familiar with 3D printer, and especially resin 3D printer. So in my case, I didn't use a filament 3D printer, the most common 3D printer you can see, because the resolution is not good enough. You cannot print something smaller than 0.1 millimeters. It's not possible, it's not supported. So I had to deal with resin 3D printer first. So I create a mold. Here you can see an example of mold with the fingerprint negative on it. Yeah, here is the creation on 3D software. So you have an empty mold in the middle of the screenshot. And on the left, you can see the Al Capone alpha black and white image. And I apply the black and white image on the mold, and it creates the fingerprint based on the level of gray and level of white of the initial picture. So that's how I create the the mold for the fake fingerprint. So when you see the video, it's really straightforward and it's really easy. But one of the biggest problem was the size, to have exactly the good size. But just to give you an idea, we will speak about the issue after. Yeah, so I use a domestic UV lit printer. The resolution of my printer is 25 micron. And in fact, it's good enough for fingerprint ridges. If you take fingerprint ridges, it's 500 microns wide and 50 microns deep. So the resolution of a domestic 3D printer is okay. We have a limited budget, so it's not a crazy expensive printer. Our global budget was lower than 2,000 euros. So it's something okay-ish in terms of price. The next step, once you have the mold, is to cast material inside of the mold to create the fingerprint. So my first idea was to use silicone, because it's really the standard stuff. You use silicone for in my mind, at least, it was the perfect stuff. We will see we had a lot of issue with material, and particularly due to some sensor. Another big issue we have is the size. We need to have the exact size. If the mold is, I don't know, 5 microns too big, it failed. The fingerprint is not the same, and the phone will say it's not a good fingerprint. So it cost me a lot of time, months of work to have the perfect size. And to make stuff more complicated, resin objects, once you print it, are toxic. You cannot use a resin printed object immediately after printing. You need to cure it in a UV chamber. The problem is UV generate retraction on object. So if you work on a figurine or stuff like that, you don't care, because the retraction is really small. It's like half millimeters. But if you play with fingerprint mold, half millimeter is too much. You have the wrong size and it doesn't work. So I had to spend a lot of time on the curing process to have exactly the same time each time, and then I have to be very careful to do the stuff exactly the same each time. Not 5 seconds more, not 5 seconds less, because it changed all my value. So that's my printer. On the left, you can see just after printing, I've got 7 molds. And on the right, you can see I remove the mold from the bed, basically. And yeah, I said to you, I had to make a lot of attempts. You can see a couple of attempts. So it's a mold that failed, and field material, like you can see silicone and stuff like that. All this stuff are failed. So it's more than 50 bad molds in a box. On the right, you can see the UV chamber I mentioned to the chamber when I have to cure my object to be safe. So the filling material, once I have the mold, I need to fill material and wait and have the fingerprint. As I said, my first idea was silicone because it's natural. In my mind, at least. But the problem is capacitive sensor work on conductivity, and silicone is isolant. You cannot put electricity through silicone. It doesn't work. And the point is, even if the fingerprint is good, the sensor will never switch on, and the authentication don't even start. So we have to think a little bit differently. And my first idea was, okay, I've got graphic powder, I've got aluminum powder. Maybe I can mix this powder with silicone and make some weird stuff like that. I try, it was a mess, and it doesn't work. It's not conductive enough. So finally, the winner is this thing. So textile glue, fabric glue. And in fact, I found it on the room of my children. And I tried it because I was hopeless. And the point is, if you make a really thin layer of fabric glue, like super thin, it's good enough to create fake fingerprint, but you can put behind the fake fingerprint a real finger with a good conductivity. And with this trick, you have a fake fingerprint and it reacts as a real finger. So it's a win. So yeah, now I speak a lot about how I did my work, and let's see the results and a few images of unlocked devices, the most funnier part.
Okay, so when we started to do the test, we wanted to do as many as possible on the variety of devices, not only on the variety of devices, but also on the operating systems. So we used embedded systems, we used phones, we used a padlock, we used a laptop, because we wanted to know how would be different if you use a sensor, because the whole stack goes from the sensor until the operating system. So there's a lot of components there that can change. So we wanted to test as many as possible on different kinds of sensors, different kinds of devices, different kinds of operating systems. So we started by testing a Samsung. In this case, you might notice that Paul is using a glove, and it still worked. Why? Because this is a Samsung S10, and they use ultrasonic sensor. And for the ultrasonic sensors, you don't actually need conductivity. The rest of the devices, as you've been seeing, they are all using active capacitive devices. So you need to put a finger behind the fake fingerprint in order for it to activate. You might notice on this one a ring around it. Let me just, yeah, there's a ring around the reader, and this is where the signal is sent into our finger back into the reader. The same happens with the previous device. If you notice it here, there's also a ring around it. So we tested all of these devices, and pretty much all of them we were able to open, with a few exceptions that we will talk further on our talk. So this is a simple table of our results. So obviously the direct collection method, it's pretty much almost always the better one, and this is because this is where we get the fingerprint with the best quality. So it would be just normal that we have the best results with it. There are a couple of outliers here. So for the Samsung A70, we were never able to defeat it, but in reality, even with the real finger, most of the times doesn't work. So yeah, it's not, we cannot take it into account. And for the Windows-based ones, we were also unable to defeat them. The same happened with the thumb drives, which also have a very specific grade of authentication. For the rest, we pretty much were able to defeat them. The Touch ID pretty much uses the same kind of stack, operating system, sensor, and database. So the results were more or less always the same. The same thing in the Samsung. It's different because they use the Samsung S10 and the Samsung Note 9. They use different kinds of sensors. So again, here there is some difference in the stack, even though the operating system is the same. So for the wrap up.
Okay. Yeah, so as I said just before, we have a low budget, so less than 2,000 US dollars. So we were not able to buy like a 10,000 medical printer and stuff like that. So it was really limited by budget. Of course, for the direct collection, there is no limitation because you have the finger of the people, you take a copy, you have the perfect size, and yeah, it works, which is not the case for the other approach. Yeah. Next. Yeah, so there is a couple of steps that could solve our issue. And the first thing is to have in my case, I was not able to have, in fact, if you think about 3D, size does not exist. If you create a 3D characters, it doesn't really have a physical size. It only have a digital size, if you wish. And if you take industrial 3D software, normally they speak about millimeters and don't really go in microns because we don't really create micron size product, at least not the software I have access. So something that could help is to have a software that is able to speak in microns and not only in millimeters. And another thing is maybe to be able to measure microns, because in my case, with my eyes, I'm not able, I cannot see if it's 1 micron too big or too large, or it's not possible. So maybe with something that is able to measure in microns, I will win a lot of time and be more efficient. Another thing is the resin we use need to be cured in a UV chamber. Maybe there is alternative material that doesn't need to be cured and we don't have this retraction. So maybe there is a better material. I simply don't have access and it's not compatible with my printer. Yeah, another thing is Windows operating system. We were not able to unlock Windows laptop, for example. So why we cannot unlock this kind of devices? So we don't have the absolute answer because we don't work for Microsoft, but we have a couple of ideas about that. The first one is when you think about fingerprint authentication, it's simply a question of threshold. You put your finger on the sensor and it takes a couple of points and decide if it's your finger or not. And the developers need to take a decision on point. If you check too much point on your finger, the problem is if your finger are dirty or wet or whatever, it won't detect your finger because it will say, oh, it's too different. It's not what I think. But in the opposite, if you don't check enough point, a finger that looks like a little bit your finger can unlock your device. So you need to decide how many points I want to decide it's the same finger. And maybe Microsoft put the threshold higher than phone, like Android or Apple or whatever. And the point is, when you use mobile, you unlock your phone, I don't know, 20 or 50 times per day. So you put your finger, you unlock it, check a message, and that's all. And having too much false positive, it's maybe frustrating for user. If you have to switch back to PIN every 10 minutes, maybe you will be really pissed. And maybe for laptop, it's not so annoying. Maybe we are most used to enter password on your laptop. So if it doesn't work and switch back to the password, you don't really care because it's normal life. And you don't unlock your computer each 10 minutes, I think. At least I don't do that. Next. So yeah, that's maybe the reason why it's so hard on Windows. The number of points mandatory to unlock, and the fact that it's less important if you have to roll back to passwords than on mobile. So mitigation, there is a couple of things you can editor can improve. For example, on Apple devices, we are limited to 5 attempts. If we fail 5 times, we have to enter a PIN, the PIN, which is a good approach in my opinion. If you take Samsung devices, you have 50 attempts. So that's 10 times more. So I can try 50 fake fingerprint, and if one works, it's good enough. If you take Honor device, it's probably unlimited. I tried 70 times and I gave up because it's freaking long. The only limitation on Android devices is after each 5 attempts, you need to wait 30 seconds. So it's 5 attempts, you wait 30 seconds, 5 attempts, 30 seconds, etc. But you can do 50 attempts finally on Samsung devices and probably unlimited attempts on our device.
So having some conclusions now. So the reason why we had a limited budget was that we wanted to make this, we wanted to know if this could be done by the average person at home. And that's why we imposed ourselves this kind of budget, such a low budget. And the point was, if that together with the threat scenarios, our goal was, is our fingerprint authentication methods good enough for the general public? And because if one needs to defend against state-sponsored agencies or state-sponsored threat actors, then it's a completely different scenarios that we need to deal with. So what we need to think is, for the average person with a low budget, is this possible? Well, in our view, fingerprint authentication is good enough for the majority of the people. If you are worried about losing your phone and someone will be able to unlock it, well, that's not something that you need to worry about having a fingerprint authentication there, because you need to think that whoever finds it needs to get your fingerprint, needs to be able to do all those attempts, you need to have a printer, needs to do with all the problems that we had, and that took months and several samples, several molds done. So it's not something that you can do just overnight to unlock the phone. However, if you are worried about some agency, if you are worried about corporate espionage, if you are worried that if your threat model is a lot more complex than this one, then of course, fingerprint authentication is not the way to go. You should use a strong password, a strong PIN with 2-factor authentication, not SMS based, all that kind of stuff. So you really need to think about what's your threat model. As we said, and the reason behind that is that it's complex. It's a time-consuming process. It's not something that you can just do overnight. and that's why you need to distinguish both scenarios. Of course, there are a lot of news about fingerprint databases being lost, being hacked, being leaked. That may increase your exposure, but still you need to think what is your threat scenario and who might want your information. So yeah, again, it should be considered safe. However, there's a big constraint here. This was first introduced in 2013. Over 7 years, the usage has been massified. However, the security of the fingerprint technology itself, it has not improved. Even with the new kinds of sensors, it has not improved. And it was broken in 2013, and the new sensors have been broken now and have been broken pretty much, all of them have been broken before. So the point here is that the exposure to the fingerprint authentication is increased, but its security has not increased as the adoption. And if something happened, it was actually the opposite, because the 3D printing technology has evolved a lot since then, and it's widely available. So there's no evolution in terms of security for the fingerprint technology. But still, you need to think that this needs to put into your threat model always. One thing that we didn't mention, Paul mentioned that we used molds. Why didn't we use direct printing? So there are a couple of points to that. First, direct printing, so the resin, when you print it directly, you can actually print with the definition enough to create a fingerprint, but it's breakable. So once you put it on top of your phone and you want to press it, it will break. So again, that's a problem. The other problem with resin is that the conductiveness that you need for the active capacitive sensors. Of course, there might be other resins that are a little more flexible or that are a little more conductible, but again, we had these limitations and we couldn't just start and go and buy all kinds of resins. So there was this purpose of being limited. And so there is no ultimate approach. There are ways that can be improved. There are some methods that can help to improve the process. I'm sure that a lot of people will pick this presentation and just try to improve some stuff. But still, in this case, what we wanted to show is that we wanted to show the process. We wanted to show how we did it, and we wanted to put it in a real life context. That was really important to us. It's not just say it's possible and that we can do it. It's say how is it possible and how did we do it and what's at stake here. In terms of improvements, of course, as Paul mentioned, if we had some kind of microscope that would allow us to compare visually the fake fingerprint and the real picture, that would help. Another way that eventually may be possible is the usage of, instead of using a mold and a casting material, using engraving techniques. So just engrave the fingerprint into some kind of material. Still, we don't know if it's possible, what would be the results, or even if there is some kind of high precision laser engraving machine within this kind of budget. Because if we expand the budget, then everything is possible. It's just a question of money and, for instance, buying a medical 3D printer. The third improvement is the scripting language. So Paul mentioned that there were problems with size. So if we did the translation from the image into the mold through a scripting language that is attached to the software that allows us to do this without having problems with the size, that would help. Actually, I know that Paul is working on that right now. Maybe we'll have some news in the future. We don't know. But there are some of these tools that actually allow the use of scripting language to work the 3D modelings and mappings. And that's it for our presentation. Now we are open to questions.
So thank you. Thank you, Vitor and Paul, for your talk. Always good to see how risky some behaviors and some actions that we take as normal and secure can be. We have at least one question. Which biometric solution, if any, will be a better alternative, on your opinion? Sure.
Well, they all have good and positive sides, and they all have negative sides. I would say that it really depends. Again, it goes against your threat model and what you are worried about. For Face ID, have been more or less defeated. Iris recognition has been defeated. So it really goes against your threat modeling and what you are worried about. At the end of the day, if you are worried about any of those, if you are worried enough to actually need to use the most secure one, then go with a strong PIN and the two-factor authentication, which is not SMS based.
Yes, somehow I agree. But seeing the last attacks that appeared this week and last week, like Google with second factor authentication not be needed to disable second factor authentication. So sometimes even second factor authentication or even the attack on Twitter, perhaps even not only the two-factor authentication, or at least like we know them today, probably mixing multiple factor authentications and multi-biometric authentications could be the solution by now. Let me see. I think no more questions. I think everyone ran away to disable their fingerprint options on their mobile phones.
Just for information, I use fingerprint authentication.
Okay.
So
Me too.
I was also asking that to you later. So glad to see your answers before.
Yeah, it's a question of threat models and
yeah.
Depend where you live. If maybe in some countries it's more tricky than some other countries, and it depends of a lot of factors. But for me, in my case, I use fingerprint for my phone.
Okay. I can say that here in Porto, as a secure city and secure country, you can use fingerprints normally. Okay. Thank you for your presentation.